بيروت بيروت، قصص كتيرة طبعت وجودنا بلبنان والعالم على مر السنين. من الميدان، بودكاست اللجنة الدولية للصليب الأحمر بلبنان، نحكي فيه عن مواضيع بتجمعنا وبتعكس أساس مهمتنا. In a world where pressing global humanitarian needs are met with limited resources, how do partnerships bridge this gap? Hi, I'm Carla, and today we talk about the sources of funds and the importance of partnerships in providing humanitarian assistance with our guest Olivier Ray, Director of Movement Mobilization and Partnerships at the ICRC. Hello, Olivier.
Hi, Carla.
Welcome to من الميدان.
Thank you.
In one of your discussions, you described the latest period as a roller coaster of crises. In your opinion, how can diplomacy, which is a slow process, keep up with urgency in times of conflict?
That's an important question. Our colleagues of our legal department at the ICRC are in charge of classifying armed conflicts throughout the world. And what they've analyzed is that the number of armed conflicts has doubled in the last decade. And that means that humanitarian needs are piling up as conflicts pile up on top of each other and aren't resolved. And so the Russia-Ukraine international armed conflict, which is a major conflict that has shaken the world, the Gaza conflict today, come on top of chronic situations of conflict and violence that haven't been resolved. And that's where the humanitarian development peace nexus comes in, and that's where the essential work of diplomacy and peacemaking should kick in. The problem is that the peace processes haven't delivered, and that often leads humanitarian actions to be pulled in to respond to crises with no end in sight. And clearly, that has created a significant overstretch in the humanitarian sector, which is asked to respond not only to acute situations of crisis, but also to these recurrent crises that never end. So our humanitarian activities shouldn't be sustained forever. We need peace in sight, and that's where diplomacy has an essential role to play. Now, there are moments, sure, diplomacy is a slow process, but there are moments where diplomacy needs to accelerate. We're seeing this today around Gaza, the number of negotiators, emissaries who try to get the parties to the conflict to some kind of resolution. So there are moments where diplomacy needs to step up its game. What I'm most concerned about is that the diplomatic system has a bit of that overstretch as well that we're seeing in the humanitarian sector. The bandwidth of multilateral organizations, but also these diplomats, is limited. And so as the world is focusing its attention on the Russia-Ukraine international armed conflict around Gaza today, there are a number of conflicts, such as what's happening in the east of the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan, where the war is still raging with no peace in immediate sight. There's less traction and less interest. That has an impact on funding availability, but also on the availability of peace solutions and negotiations.
So all of these processes that you just mentioned are mainly done maybe behind the scenes in a discreet manner, but emergency responses and most of them that are done on the ground, these require resources. So where does the ICRC get its resources from, and how can it maintain its independence, which is one of its principles, especially when it comes to political agendas around the world?
That is crucial. The ICRC's resources come essentially from states. And that's not surprising, nor is it problematic as such, because we have been mandated by states through the Geneva Conventions that have been signed and ratified by 196 states to assist them in the implementation of international humanitarian law, in the protection of populations affected by conflict and violence. And so it is legitimate that these states fund the action of the ICRC. And in a way, it matters also because we need these states to be stakeholders of our success. success and to help us deliver on our mandate. So having states fund the ICRC is fundamental. Now, two elements. One, when we are financed by a small number of states, that becomes a problem, because if we are over-reliant on 1, 2, 3, 4 states, then what's at stake is our capacity to be neutral, independent, and autonomous in our decision-making processes. So that'll always be a critical factor in our own choices, and this is why we're working on the diversification of our resources, of our income, and that's true. We're doing this in a number of ways. We're discussing with states who are signatories of the Geneva Convention, but that haven't been traditionally significant donors of the ICRC. And typically emerging countries whose economies is now allowing them through significant budget increases to be a funder of humanitarian assistance, we're working on these relays, and a state such as South Korea, for example, has joined the ICRC's top 25 donors recently, and if we manage to get more state donors on board, we're reducing our dependency on our traditional donors. But we're also working more and more with private sector actors, be they corporates, companies, foundations, private individuals, or high net worth individuals. The world has more and more crises. The humanitarian needs are increasing, but the world is also getting richer. And we need to be able to tap into these sources of wealth. And high net worth individuals, corporations, foundations understand that they need and they want to give back. And funding humanitarian assistance is a good way to give back and to share some of that wealth with the populations that are the most vulnerable and the most in need of assistance worldwide, i.e. those populations that are on the front line, that are out of reach of state and national authorities, out of reach of public services. And so this diversification of our funding between states, but also with private actors, is critical to maintain our autonomy, independence, neutrality, because this is the crown jewel of the ICRC. Definitely. This is what allows us to be accepted throughout the world and to have access to the population. So we will preserve that independence, even if it means refusing funding from this or that actor, because it could jeopardize not only our independence, but also the perception of our independence. And so we do refuse every year significant amounts.
A number of donors.
Exactly, because they come from donors who could pose a risk to our reputation.
Okay, so that's very interesting, because we'll talk a lot about donors, but in the ICRC we also talk a lot about partners and partnerships. So how do you think partnerships contribute to achieving the ICRC's broader humanitarian objectives? And if you have a concrete example that you can tell us more about.
Yeah, I have a number of examples that I'm happy to put forward. We, in our new institutional strategy, clearly that notion of partnership stands out very strongly. The ICRC historically was a do-it-yourself organization. That's how perhaps we were perceived. And it's important to keep some capacity to deliver autonomously humanitarian assistance rapidly where it's most needed. And when you depend on 5 different partners to deliver, then you're less quick, less agile. And so the ICRC will maintain a capacity to go it alone when that is necessary. But the reality is we've changed a lot as a humanitarian organization. And the way we work with our partners from the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, for example, is I think a good illustration of that partnership built in our response capacity. We are lucky to be part of a worldwide movement with something like 15 million staff and volunteers throughout the world, through 191 national societies that have links from very local areas and the links with the population to the communities to the authorities, and that is part of the Red Cross Red Crescent's reach. The ICRC operates from within the Red Cross Red Crescent movement, and the quality of the relationships that we build with partners such as the Lebanese Red Cross. I just come from Baghdad, and we have an excellent relationship as well with the Iraqi Red Crescent. These are just two examples of the way the ICRC delivers its protection and assistance work in a very, very strong collaboration with these sisters, cousins of the ICRC. But there are other types of partners with which we work as well. I was recently in Washington at the Fragility Forum of the World Bank, where the key theme was how do we collaborate between humanitarian and development partners. And I think that's a good illustration of what partnership can bring when everyone is very clear about their role and their respective added values. For a long time, this was a messy space between humanitarian and development actors, and I've seen a lot of turf wars. It was about grabbing budgets in a moment where it was about the funding. If that's your starting point, you're sure to get it wrong, and that doesn't deliver quality impact. I think the partners have learned, and where a real added value has been created is when humanitarian and development actors typically start from their differences, their unique added value, and it's because they're different that they can create value by partnering up. Typically, development actors have a long-term vision. They have patient capital. They can invest over 4, 5, 6 years, while humanitarian actors tend to have short-term budgets built on the premise that emergencies aren't necessarily long-lasting. And so a collaboration that I've just witnessed in Mosul, for example, with the French Development Agency, is a good illustration of that, and the local water authorities. You remember that from 2014 to 2017, Mosul was under the control of the Islamic State group. There was heavy fighting in 2017, and the water infrastructure was severely damaged in the city. The ICRC was present from the very first days to restore water. But you can't stay in an emergency mode forever. You can't do water trucking for months or years. That's not an effective use of precious humanitarian funds, but it's not dignified for the populations who deserve a proper public service. So from the outset, the ICRC was working with the Department of Water of Mosul to support the authorities in restoring the service. But to keep that collaboration going and to take it up to scale, we needed to find resources that weren't short-term humanitarian budgets. And that's where we reached out to a development partner. And that development partner was keen to be able to enter into a governorate where they know that they couldn't have gone alone. They were looking for a partner that had the understanding, the networks, the fine political economy analysis of the situation. And it's that triangle of partners, a development-backed donor, an ICRC humanitarian actor in support of a local water authority that has made it happen and that has allowed to move from water trucking, which is necessary, but the basics of humanitarian assistance that we need to step away from, to today a more and more optimized water network that serves not only the households of Mosul, but also some internally displaced populations that need dignified access to water. So this is an example of how partnering up allows to work with the different added values and progressively and responsibly hand over the work from the humanitarian to the development actor to, and that's more fundamental, the local authorities who can step back into their to their roles, and that allows them to regain the legitimacy in the eyes of the population.
Yeah, so I was actually just about to ask you about a partnership that required collaboration among different stakeholders and different sectors. So you just mentioned it. So regarding the dynamics of this partnership, sometimes maybe it is hard to navigate. So how was your experience, and what were the takeaways you got from this kind of experience?
Let me give you another example here in Lebanon that I know well, because I used to sit on the other side of the fence, being responsible for the French Development Agency here in Lebanon. And it was the partnership that the ICRC, the Rafik Hariri Hospital, and AFD started building a number of years ago. This hospital is a public hospital, which is critical to delivering health, including for populations that are vulnerable. And the ICRC had done a lot to rehabilitate certain services in the hospital to make sure that the standards were increased. And it so happens that a lot of that rehabilitation work was done just before COVID hit. And
they played a very important role during COVID.
Yeah, and I think the Lebanese population realized this. Had it not been for the capacity of the Rafik Hariri Hospital to withstand that shock, being on the front line of the response, I think the health system in Lebanon would have taken a much bigger shock in the populations, a bigger toll. And that partnership was taken forward with funding from a development actor, which has allowed for capacity building, for more investment. And when you look at it, there are a number of shocks that this partnership has gone through. Thawra, but also
the revolution.
The blast, the Beirut blast, and all of these shocks could have jeopardized the capacity of the hospital to deliver. On the contrary, that collaboration made the public hospital, more resilient for the population.
And it's an ongoing partnership still.
It's continuing, but at some point the ICRC will be able to take a few steps back because the Ministry of Health and the hospital will be owning these services, will have stepped up their capacities, and that's really the feeling I had. It so happens I was meeting with the director this morning, with the Minister of Health earlier as well, and you could feel that this is not the ICRC's project or AFD's project. This is the Rafik Hariri Hospital's staff's own project, and this makes me feel confident that progressively that ownership will be there, and the ICRC will be able to move on to other activities with the hospital or elsewhere in the country. So it's another example of a responsible handover strategy between different actors, where initially the ICRC invests a lot of time, energy, funding, and progressively this is taken up by local actors. What have we learned from this partnership? One, that you need to be patient.
It takes time.
It takes time to identify every actor's added value, to combine them. It also takes time to deliver results. When you're talking about capacity building, strengthening of infrastructure, etc., you need to give it the necessary time. But thirdly, you need to start with the end in mind. And therefore, thinking about a responsible handover strategy from the outset of a program is critical. Now, the handover can take place earlier or later, depending on the evolution of events, but it's essential to start an activity thinking, how sustainable will it be? Who will pick it up moving forward? Otherwise, I think we're not doing our work responsibly, because fundamentally it's about creating the capacity of the system to withstand the shocks. And today, as Lebanon is preparing for the risk of other shocks, having a functional hospital that has learned from COVID, that has learned from the Beirut blast, is essential. Crucial. And when I look at the preparedness planning happening, you can tell that the Lebanese public system, the Lebanese population, the Lebanese Red Cross, which is key to this resilience, has been learning from one shock to the other, and I think has quite a lot to teach to the world, I would say, because that experience is inbuilt.
Yeah. So, Olivier, like you said, you're not new to the Lebanese context or the Middle East context. So, if we ask you today to say a few words to mobilize funds for the Middle East and for Lebanon in particular, what would you say?
I actually do that every day because I'm in charge of fundraising for the ICRC, and we have these conversations with donors on a regular basis. I tend to pitch the humanitarian needs generally, rather than geographically. Why? Because the ICRC wants to maintain quality, flexible funding in order to be able to respond where needs are most acute. And so when I have this dialogue with donors, I use examples from the Middle East, from Lebanon, from Africa, from Asia, but I ask them for quality funding, which means more predictable funding and more flexible funding so that we can use it where we most acutely need it. Now, looking at the Middle East, we can unfortunately see an equation which is worrying. We see how dramatic the situation is in Gaza. I think this is high on everybody's mind. And we see the regional dynamics playing out and the risks of one conflict igniting another one. And these localized conflicts taking then a dynamic of their own. So we are in a preparedness phase throughout the region, and we're monitoring these conflict dynamics. What I'm asking donors is to help us prepare, because $1 Swiss franc, euro invested in that preparedness phase before the conflict or the humanitarian situation escalates is €1 Swiss franc that is well invested. But I'm more importantly asking our partners to play their role in the diplomatic field, because sometimes there's a temptation to sign a check for humanitarian assistance as a way for states not really to deliver on their core responsibility. The ICRC always reminds states of the obligations they have under the Geneva Conventions, not only to respect international humanitarian law, but also to ensure respect of IHL. And we've had very frank conversations with a number of donors recently, telling them that disrespect for states' obligations under international humanitarian law has a huge cost. The humanitarian cost is evident because when hospitals are targeted, when water infrastructure is brought down, when universities are targeted, the human cost is insane. But then the humanitarian cost to cover these needs is 100 times that of prevention, and the cost of reconstruction are those that you imagine. Look at Gaza today. Imagine the amounts of funding that will be needed to reconstruct dignified livelihoods for the populations in Gaza. And so first and foremost, we ask states to respect and ensure respect of international humanitarian law. It was true in the international armed conflict between Ukraine and Russia. It's true today around Gaza. This is the first priority. Humanitarian funding is needed, but less funding will be needed if IHL is respected.
Thank you so much, Olivier, for being with us today and sharing your experience.
Thanks for having me.
Sure. من الميدان، بودكاست اللجنة الدولية للصليب الأحمر بلبنان، حتى شهرية لتكتشفوا قصص ما انحكت. تابعونا على منصات البودكاست ومواقع التواصل الاجتماعي. Over and out.